Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about an analysis of variance that uses repeated measures. To do this, I'm going to walk you through an article that I have referenced in the class, and we will go through it and talk about the different components, both the strengths and the potential challenges of this article. So the title of our article is The Comparative Effect of Internet-Based Cognitive Behavioral Counseling versus Face-to-Face Cognitive Behavioral Counseling in Terms of Student Resilience. So we have our abstract, which gives us a general overview that this was a randomized controlled trial experimental study, and it's comparing the effects of CBC counseling between online and face-to-face. 90 students in junior high in Bali, Indonesia, were divided into 3 groups. One group received the in-person counseling for 8 weeks, 55 minutes, and then 30 groups were in the internet-based, which were online modules, and then 30 students were on a wait list. And they used the Resilience Youth Development module, junior high school level, and the data was analyzed using a repeated measures ANOVA. And these were the results of the test summarized, or of the study summarized. So let's jump right in. So first things first, every article you're going to see is going to have a synthesis of the literature. In articles, it's really important that this be very succinct and concise. So you really have to synthesize the material. So when I look at this, I see, there's serial citations. There's some serial citations here. Each paragraph, for the most part, has a diversity of resources, and it's really building a case for why this should be looked at and why it's important to look at the different modalities of counseling and what the hope is that this will help with. So we'll go through, and that gives some additional information about the study. When it comes to this section right here, I wanted to highlight this. I'm trying to highlight just this sentence. This sentence is the purpose of the study. The study's aim is to examine the effectiveness of face-to-face cognitive behavioral group counseling and internet-based cognitive behavioral counseling to improve the resilience of junior high school students. Then they list the hypotheses. Now, I have some issues with the way they wrote the hypotheses. So the first one says there are statistically significant increases in resilience in students of the cognitive behavioral group. Now, if they had said that the resilience of students in the cognitive behavioral group counseling were higher than the others, I could have accepted that. This, however, is more of a statement of fact and not really a hypothesis. Same thing for the second one. There are statistically significant increases in the resilience. I would have preferred that they said that students' resilience is higher for the internet-based cognitive behavioral counseling than the group counseling and the control. So those two statements really aren't stated well as hypotheses. This one, there's statistically significant differences in resilience between the students in the 3 groups. That one's good. I can use that one. The resilience of these students in the cognitive behavioral counseling is higher than the resilience in the weight-controlled group. That one's okay. The resilience of the participants in the internet is higher than the wait list. That one's okay. And then the resilience of students in the internet-based cognitive behavioral counseling is higher than the students in cognitive behavioral group counseling. So those are better. Now, I would have preferred that for this particular group, that they had more clarity and would have specified face-to-face each time that it was mentioned. One of the things that's important when you're doing research is to be super consistent with the language that you're using so that your readers don't get confused. So if I'm going to call this the face-to-face cognitive behavioral group counseling group, that's the way I'll refer to it throughout. Same thing, if this is going to be the internet-based counseling, I'm going to refer to it that way throughout. Let's move on to participants. So in this particular description, they talk about the number of students that were involved, where they were from, the mean age of 12 years, what academic years they were looking at, that there were 308 students who were followed with the pretest of resilience measure. 102 of those students were in a low to moderate range, and they specify what that is, equal to or less than 42. And the students, 90 students, were randomly placed in one of the three studied groups. Now, there's more information here I would have liked to have known. I would have liked to have known about the student's gender. I would have liked to have known about maybe their placement in school, if they were, what type of student they were. There's a lot more information that would have been helpful to understand in order to really understand to whom these studies results can be generalized. They also describe 6 school counselors who are going to be helping with the particular project study, and also maybe some of the credentials, but not enough. I would have liked a lot more credentials. I would have liked to have known about the mean age, the mean years of experience. I would have liked to have known, how long they had been at their particular school, if they had pre-existing relationships with the students. All of that information would have helped me understand the results just a little bit deeper. Okay. So for assessments, they're going to be using the resiliency scale, and they talk about how that resiliency scale is rated on an inappropriate, less appropriate, sufficiently appropriate, and very appropriate score, and how they tally that up. Now, one of the challenges here is that this is a Likert scale, because we know that there's not going to be equal distance between my inappropriate and my less appropriate, as there would be somebody else's inappropriate to less appropriate. So this is really ordinal data that's being scored as if it was scaled. So there's a measurement error there that we would want to call out in our weaknesses and our critique of this particular study. The resiliency scale, again, was the resiliency youth development. They provide some information about the factor loading from a factorial analysis, and they indicate that 14 of the items produced adequately assess the 5 dimensions of resilience, but they provide none of the data to support that. I don't know what the validity ratings were for these 5 areas. I don't know how well they loaded. So there's a lot more questions here than answers for me. I want to know more. I also want to know about the validity. Is there construct validity? Is congruent validity? What type of other resources do I have to support the validity of the scale for this particular population? I do have an alpha Cronbach's reliability test of 0.777, which is pretty strong, and it is definitely considered adequate. You'll see that they cited a source to back up their claim that this is reliable, this reliability is acceptable. The students participated in different ways, which is also potentially another weakness. The internet students did their measurements electronically. The participants did their in the face-to-face, and the waitlist did theirs by paper and pencil. So there's some potential issues with there being different modalities of administering the assessment. Not a guaranteed risk, but certainly something to call out and wonder about, and wonder if there's a way to improve that so that each student is completing in the same way, so that the modality of the completion of the assessment isn't potentially a confound. Now we're going to look at not only the 3 groups that the students were divided in, but we're going to look at 3 scores or 3 stages in which the data is collected. So they're going to complete a pre-test, a post-test, and a 5 weeks after counseling to do as a follow-up. So those are going to be our time stages, and that's what makes it repeated measures, because the same students are being tested 3 times. It is an experimental study that's used randomly controlled trial design, multi-stage sampling process where they select and assign the group. They select the students based on having a low or medium resilience. So in that particular situation, that doesn't feel very random to me, right? So you've got this big group, and it seems more purposeful or criterion sampling. The next stage, the people who meet the criteria that equal to or less than 42 are going to be randomly assigned to different groups. And you're going to have 2 experimental groups, 1 face-to-face and 1 internet, and 1 control group. Those groups are going to be broken out even more in a minute. So the face-to-face groups had, I think, 3 in-person groups with 10 students each, and those 10 students would meet with 1 counselor 8 weeks for 55 minutes each week. And the internet group was more of an internet module basis where the counselor and the student are interacting in a way that is asynchronous. So it's more of an online module, so students completing and receiving indirect feedback from the feedback via email from the counselor. And so those are how they are. And then the waitlist students, they did not receive any counseling during the period of the study, but were given the option to choose one of the interventions after the study had been completed and the 5-week assessment had happened. So one of the highlights of this particular study is they have some really good figures and tables. So I really like this flow chart of the study, where they had the 308 students, they randomized the 102 that could qualify for the study into these 3 groups. They explain why they excluded people. They've broken it up into phases: enrollment, allocation, post-test follow-up. So here is the groups that they broke up into. Here's what they did. So it's a good overview and good visual of that. They also explain the face-to-face cognitive behavioral counseling procedures, the 8 weeks or 8 sessions for 55-minute sessions, required at least 2 months to do the whole process, 10 students per group with a school counselor. They give a little bit of rationale for that. Then they explain the internet-based counseling. And then they go through the process of what that looks like. It's definitely an online asynchronous module process. There's 15 students in each group with 2 counselors overseeing 2 groups. So there were 2 groups of the internet, 15 and 15, and there were 3 groups of the face-to-face with 10 students in each group. The data analysis was conducted using repeated measures analysis of variance. So they looked at the 3 groups and then the 3 factors of time management. So the description of the counseling process. So first, they looked at the internet-based cognitive process took less time and less counselor effort than the face-to-face, but it wasn't necessarily more cost-effective due to some of the cost of the system and the cost of internet access. So they talk about the time. They talk about the fastest time required was 3 weeks for the internet modules, 10 times accessing. It was about plus or minus 30 minutes for each session. The longest time being 5 weeks, 12 times accessing, with the student average time spent in each session, plus or minus 30 minutes. This describes the pre-test, post-test, and follow-up resiliency. So here's the time breakout where they took the different assessments, and here are the group conditions. They report the pre-test. Now, one of the things that I would want to do initially is run an ANOVA on this pre-test to see if there are significant differences between the 2. It appears visually that there isn't, because there's not much difference between them. And that's probably a benefit of it being randomized. So in this particular situation, though, I would run an ANOVA on this pretest just to make sure there weren't any significant differences. If there were significant differences in the pretest, I would have to consider running an ANCOVA, because if one group is more anxiety than the other group, I can't then just compare the post-test and just subtract the 2, right? Because if they start out at different places, I have to adjust for that pre-existing difference using the covariance. In this particular case, though, it looks fairly similar. And then we have our post-test and our follow-up. And then here we have our main effect group, remembering that's for our independent variable of group. So the condition of group, whether it was the face-to-face, the internet, or the waiting group. And so here, and the reason it's degrees of freedom, right, is because there were 3 groups minus 1. So we had 2 here. And this is our F score, which is 384.472, a p-value of 0.0. This isn't an accurate report. We don't report a p-value of 0.00 because it's pretty much impossible to actually achieve that. It's more likely that it is a p-value less than 0.001, and that's just a much longer number. In SPSS, it does sometimes report this, though, so that's why they did this, but it would be more accurate to report this as less than 0.001, because it's really not possible to have 0 chance. We have our partial eta square here, which is a pretty strong, large effect size of 0.89. Anything over a 0.14 is considered a large effect in eta square. And then they go in to report the resiliency of the students, and they give a description of what's in the table. So for table 1, it talks about the mean resiliency score from pre-test to post-test to follow-up. In table 2, it gives a narrative description of the group effects, the group main effect, providing us with our decision, our results sentence here, which is the information that I provided. Again, I do think it would be more accurate to report this p-value as p less than 0.001, and noting that this p should also be italicized. And then it provides the effect size, and I would say with a large effect size of, and give the results. Here's the time, and they also looked at the interaction effect. Remember, that's one of the benefits of having a factor ANOVA, because this is actually a factorial repeated measures ANOVA, because we had 2 independent factors. We had group condition and we had time condition. So here we have the time, which is showing to be significant. Again, I'd report that as less than 0.001 with a large partial eta square. And then my interaction of time and group, so pre-test face-to-face versus pre-test internet, or pre-test face-to-face versus post-test face-to-face. Again, we see that we have a p-value of 0.05, so I can report that exact p-value, or say that it is less than 0.01, because this would not be less than 0.001. I have, again, a large effect size here, and so I would report that. And then here's the comparison of the resilience scores when you've done what's called a Bonferroni adjustment. So again, I'm looking to see which one is significant. And so I've got these 2 that are significant. So there's a significant difference between the internet and the wait list and the face-to-face in the wait list. You can also see the significance is indicated by this asterisk here, by single asterisk, which is not actually accurate in standard process. We would have at least a double asterisk or even a triple asterisk, because this is indicative of it being a p-value less than 0.001, which is usually indicated by 3 asterisks together. Same thing here. So again, I would report this as less than 0.001 and not as 0.0. I can report the upper bounds and lower bounds of my 95% confidence interval. So here it talks about the major effect of time, which is right here. And so it gives me my decision here. Again, I would say large effect size, where the interaction effect by time to groups is significant with a large effect size. I would correct that. And then it confirmed the third hypothesis, which is language that kind of drives me crazy, because we don't confirm a hypothesis, but because some of those hypotheses were worded weirdly in the beginning, we always want to reject or fail to reject our hypotheses. So that would be more accurate description and more accurate language. If I was a reviewer for this particular article before it was published, I would definitely give that feedback and ask for that correction. They describe table 4 here, where they're talking about the mean difference between the 2 groups. And again, it's accurate to say p less than 0.05, but because it was 0.000, I would say it was more accurate, not better, but more accurate to report the p-value is less than 0.001. And here, because this is a p-value of greater than 0.05, this is accurate, because that's our ultimate cutoff for determining whether or not we would reject or fail to reject. And this one, it's saying it did not differ, so it's appropriate to report it as a p-value greater than 0.05. Again, p should be italicized, but when it's less than here and my p-value is actually really, really small, I'm going to report it to that lowest cutoff, which is 0.001. So again, very similar pattern. Again, I'd say large effect here. And then we go into the discussion. And the discussion, they, try to understand the results in relation to the existing literature, and also try to offer some explanations for why things might be a certain way, or why they may not be a certain way. So that's important to know as well. One of the things that, before we go further into the discussion, I just wanted to point out up here, it talks about in table 3, the major effect of time, and it reports on 2 levels of time, post-test and follow-up. This is a little bit of a disconnect from the previous part of the study where they talked about the fact they were going to be comparing pre-test, post-test, and follow-up test. It doesn't look like they actually did that. It looks like they used the pre-test as a screening tool and to establish that baseline. And then they just compared the post-test with the follow-up test. And that is kind of a miss. I would have probably run this as an repeated measures, factorial, and COVA, so that I could have controlled for the pre-test, even though there didn't appear to be too much difference between the pre-testing groups, but that would have been a kind of more accurate way of running it and to control for pre-existing differences in resilience. But at the very least, I would have at least included pre-test to post-test to see if there were significant differences, and then the same for post-test to follow-up. So I was a little confused why they only did post-test to follow-up. And then back to the discussion, there's some wording here that isn't exactly accurate. So like, for example, here, they say the results of the study showed that the effectiveness of internet-based cognitive behavioral counseling is equal to the face-to-face counseling. So this is a good example of when you make a claim about your results that far exceeds what your results actually did. They didn't assess for effectiveness in this particular study. That was not what they were doing. They were assessing whether there was a difference in resilience. So don't make that jump, right? Because effectiveness and difference in resilience, they're different. And so, there was no attempt to measure the effectiveness of it. It was just measuring if there was a difference. And I would think effectiveness would be much, much broader than just a change in resilience. So sometimes you have to be really cognizant of the language that you use and make sure you're not making jumps in logic and proposing that your study means more than what it actually does. A couple of other things just to note in writing research. This is kind of thing that I like to point out here. So this is a good example of what we call vagary in research. It's talking about the meta-analysis study concluded. I'm confused, right? I don't know what meta-analysis study, and it would be meta-analytic study, is being talked about here because they have the reference at the end. So instead of having some vague reference to your study, you should just put the name of the study at the beginning. So I might rewrite this to say Anderson et al., period, parentheses, 2014, parentheses, concluded in their meta-analytic study, right? And that would be much clearer. Same thing here, studies by Hendam and colleagues, and then it goes into all those dates. I might just say Hendam and colleagues, and then have these dates in parentheses, 2011, 2014, 2012, consistently showed that internet basis, right? There's a lot of extra words here by studies by, that's not necessary. And I don't need to repeat this part because I've already included Hendam and colleagues. So this Hendam et al. Is repetitive. So that's just some little writing tips to think about when you're trying to write succinctly and clearly in your writing. Let's see, what else did I have? One more thing up here that I noticed is this particular description right here, especially this last part right here. This is actually a repeated section. So this is repeated verbatim from the previous page. So you're going to make sure you're not repeating. Articles have very limited space, and so you don't want to repeat material twice. You want to say it once and be done with it. So that was something that stood out to me. And then, as I mentioned previously, there was a lot more of information I would have liked to have known about the students and the faculty, the counselors that helped. I would want to know a lot more details about their demographics that I believe could be potential confounds that would impact the results. And then finally, there is another claim here. It says the studies in this also indicated school counselor preparation is critical in conducting inter-based counseling. I agree with that statement. I just don't know how this particular study supported that. They did talk about the counselors having some minimal training and some tech training and then some tech difficulties, but I don't know if tech difficulties equals the need for counselor preparation. I totally agree with the statement. We need to have training in conducting internet-based counseling. Just don't know if this study supported that finding or that conclusion. So be sure that your results, your discussion, your conclusion are directly tied to what you studied, and don't jump out or expand your results to mean more than what they actually mean. So that is my review of a repeated measures factorial ANOVA. I hope this was helpful. And as always, let me know if you have any questions.